As I explained in my last video, many people believe that capitalism is the inevitable path of the future. For Americans raised on this belief, it can be easy to fall into the trap of believing this myth. From a young age, we are taught in schools that capitalism is not only a good system of government, but the best and only system that can be functioning for us and our future. We believe it to be a fact and are taught not to question the systems that have created our nation. Our culture, our institutions, and even our religious beliefs are built on top of capitalism, furthering the belief that all our systems are dependent on this larger system and that its very existence is inevitable. Yet, when we can take a step back and look at the systems we have come to trust more critically, we can see that there are alternatives to capitalism, and a future outside of this system is possible and worth hoping for. While it can be easy to give into the belief that the system of capitalism is inevitable in global human development, the truth is, nothing is truly inevitable, and when we are able to encompass hope, we can see that a different future is possible after all. The first step to countering the myth that capitalism is inevitable is to come at it from a strategy of hope. When we can first denounce the notion of inevitability when it comes to anything, we can see that even gigantic systems that control world governments and institutions, like capitalism, are not inevitable, after all. It takes a degree of hope to be able to see this, and to imagine a future where capitalism is not the widely accepted norm. When first brainstorming how to disprove this myth, I found myself stumped. It is easy to fall into a pit of despair when it feels like the odds are so stacked against a theory that the activism of one small person or dedicated group cannot make a difference. Yet I found inspiration in the words of Rebecca Solnit, author of Hope in the Dark. In this series of essays, Solnit explains that being hopeful is not the same as being blindly optimistic. When laying out what it means to be hopeful, Solnit explains that one must acknowledge the struggles that lie ahead, but never acknowledge the impossibility. In terms of debunking the myth of capitalism, it is important to understand how ingrained this myth is in our society, and to understand that many who speak out against capitalism become written off and discredited for their distrust in the system. Solnit says, hope doesn't mean denying these realities. Hope is not the belief that everything is, was, or will be fine. Yet at the same time, we must acknowledge that the world is constantly changing. Ideologies are shifting, and people and movements that were once radical and on the fringe are now finding themselves at the heart of conversations in America. We must believe that change is possible. For most, inevitability is a way of dealing with an unknown future. Human nature is to fear the dark, what we cannot see. Despite this nature, Rebecca Solnit says, when you recognize uncertainty, you recognize that you may be able to influence the outcomes. With myths of inevitability, we are able to predict the future, to say that history will repeat itself, that giant systems in place were destined to be here and will be destined to stay. These myths don't account for radical revolutions. They don't hold us responsible for the change we want to see in the world. Rather, they allow us to sit back and watch and lament at the world we live in that could not be changed. If the future is certain, then there is no point in trying to change it. But if the future is uncertain, that is terrifying. It is terrifying because, in the end, if we create a better future or a worse one, it is something we created and we are responsible for. Capitalism is not the destiny of the world, but rather a conscious choice that people in power are making, and a choice that people suffering as a result of it are choosing to let happen to them. So, in a world that can seem hopelessly unchangeable, it is important to remember what hope really means. Hope just means another world might be possible, not promised, not guaranteed. Hopelessness is always easier. Hopelessness is the philosophy of the apathetic. Mountains have only ever been moved by those who dared to hope it was possible. In the same sense, great social change is only possible when we remind ourselves that nothing is inevitable. Now that we are able to understand what it means to be hopeful, we must ask ourselves, why should we be hopeful? After all, blind hope without ambition is just as dangerous as apathy. Often when taking up a big cause, it is easy to become discouraged. Change moves at a snail's pace, and often we are unable to see it happening in real time. Yet, change is happening all around us. It's beginning on the outskirts, and usually goes unacknowledged until it explodes. Rebecca Solnit compares the change incurred by social movements to the growth of mushrooms. Often after a rainstorm, one can go outside and see amazing patches of mushrooms popping up overnight, seemingly out of nowhere. There was no sign of mushrooms before the storm hit, and yet, unlike flowers, they've just appeared out of thin air. What we don't see is what is happening underground, in the sunshine before the storm hits. Mushrooms are the cause of underground fungus and chemicals that come together to bloom once the water releases them. The ingredients for the mushrooms are always there, but often are not being paid attention until they explode. In the same way, advocates of social change are always there, in the shadows, on the outskirts, advocating for the changes they wish to see in the world. Grassroots climate organizations were active and working for change long before Greta Thunberg launched the massive climate strike in the fall of 2019. The Black Lives Matter movement began in 2013, launching organizations to protest racism and help promote black excellence long before the murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor. For pessimists and the apathetic, these movements can seem hopeless and pointless. We can look at protesters who have dedicated their lives to massive causes and find themselves still unsatisfied with the minimal changes that have happened. That is a good reason to be discouraged, but never a reason to give up. As Rebecca Solnit says, it's always too soon to go home. We must remain aware of how far we need to go. We must remain hungry for change and equality, and demand a better world for everyone. But, for the sake of our own sanity, our hope, we must also celebrate the victories to keep momentum behind movements. When we can look back on the victories we've had, it can give us hope to keep going. Right now, the United States is not a great place to be a person of color. Many eyes have been opened in the last month to see just how real the racism of the police and brutality against people and communities of color are. We can see how the prison system works to increase voter suppression of people of color and has become a modern-day system of slavery. We know that neighborhoods of color are more highly policed, and the direct result is the oppression, death, and incarceration of black and brown people. We cannot forget that. We must fight to end that, but at the same time, we must have hope that we can end that. The change is possible and worth fighting for. A little over 50 years ago, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, and the result was months of unrest, violence, and rioting in our country. A man who protested peacefully and spoke of his love and dreams for humanity was gunned down for his radical views. Radical views that someday children would no longer be barred from entering schools, theaters, and bathrooms just because of the color of their skin. In just half a century, we have seen many of his dreams come true. Because of the activism and determination and the momentum that movements led by incredibly hopeful people, reforms were made, laws were passed, and we have seen changes happen. We still have a long way to go. America is not a country of equal opportunity or treatment yet, but we can still acknowledge that change is possible, as it has already happened. We can see that radical ideas can inspire a nation, and with the hope of a king, we can move mountains. Civil rights leaders have made so much progress, but they have not given up. They have not become satisfied with this. They see that there is still progress to be made, and a wave of future leaders are flooding to the streets, calling for change, demanding action. It isn't happening overnight, but change is happening, and we must hold on to the hope that this change evokes. Susan Griffin said, "I've seen enough change in my lifetime to know that despair is not only self-defeating, it is unrealistic. Capitalism controls our lives, our systems of government, and our culture." After the 1842 decision of Commonwealth versus Hunt, unions were legalized in the United States and workers were able to use legal means to advocate for their rights and goals. Since the legalization of labor unions, laws were then advocated for and signed to protect workers. Child labor laws were passed protecting children from being put to work at young ages. Workers' compensation acts were passed, ensuring that if one is injured or killed on the job, their family is liable to compensation. In the 1960s, civil rights acts were passed ensuring that people could not be fired due to race, religion, or sex. Just this last week, the Supreme Court ruled that this law also protects LGBTQ+ people from being fired due to any of their identities as well. While these victories have not toppled the system of capitalism, they have worked to change it. Furthermore, the introduction of social service acts, which have been passed since the Great Depression, have helped to protect the rights of people to a fair wage and living expenses. A small amount of money parceled out through Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid provides funds to the elderly, poor, and disabled, prioritizing their well-being over their ability to contribute to the capitalist system. While great conflicts can erupt and bring attention to a cause, it is the work of dedicated individuals fighting against corruption that can sometimes make the biggest, albeit least known, effects for a movement. Heroes can come out of the unlikeliest of places, and as Rebecca Solnit says, sometimes a few passionate people can change the world. In 1938, in response to socialist programs passing under the FDR administration, Congress established the House Un-American Activities Committee. This organization of conservative congressmen used the power of the subpoena as a weapon to spread a fear of communism throughout the country. Actors, politicians, and activists were summoned to testify in front of Congress for suspected communist sympathization. The results of these hearings, whether the convicted were found guilty or not, were career-ending. Most of those subpoenaed by the committee found themselves blacklisted in their desired fields, as nobody was willing to associate with an accused communist. The fear that was stoked by prominent members of this committee, led by Joseph McCarthy, discouraged people from speaking out against capitalist oppression. Activists who sought to educate people on class consciousness were deemed communist traitors of the United States. Prominent actor Charlie Chaplin was punished for his personal ideology, as the director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, attempted to have him deported and refused to let him back into the country when he traveled to London. For those who dared to speak their views, the results could be career-ending. Harlem Renaissance poet Langston Hughes was called to testify in front of the committee after publishing poetry with particularly leftist views in it. In order to remain relevant in his field, Hughes refrained from publishing political poetry after his hearing. Composer Leonard Bernstein, after supporting protests of the Vietnam War as well as the Black Panther Party, became a target of Hoover. He was spied on by the FBI for the next 30 years, blacklisted by CBS, and denied a request to renew his passport. Capitalism was such a vital and protected system in our country that those with any platform would be severely punished for speaking out against it. Those in Hollywood, or hoping to make a name for themselves in Washington, had to be cautious. Freedom of speech did not protect anyone from Joseph McCarthy. Speaking one's mind could be incredibly dangerous and usually career suicide. Today, not only are politicians free to speak out against capitalism, but for some, it has been a cornerstone of their career. Senator Bernie Sanders has backed the ideology for the duration of his political career, including 2 presidential bids for office. He has garnered a massive following, bringing attention to the issues of social inequality that prevails under the current capitalist system. Furthermore, today, celebrities are free to speak out in favor of anti-capitalist ideologies without the fear of becoming blacklisted. In this year alone, Sanders gained a tremendous following of supporters in Hollywood, individuals who were active in spreading his message to their fan base. Not only has Sanders inspired many Americans, both through his own politics and activism, but also through his high-profile fan base, but he has begun to inspire newcomers to Congress as well. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a freshman on the congressional floor, has gained notoriety in the political world for her outspoken support of policies such as the Green New Deal, but also for her self-declared socialist identity. Cortez has gained many adversaries among the Conservative Party, but unlike those who dared to speak out and challenge the seemingly inevitable institutions during the Red Scare, Cortez has established a solid political career for herself, becoming one of the most popular and most beloved members of Congress. When we look back on the progress that has been made to move our country forward, we can see that hope is very tangible. To acknowledge the flaws in our capitalist system and work for a better vision for the future is not foolish. We have made progress, and if we keep working, we can continue to make progress. Change is slow, but not impossible, so long as we do not fall for the temptation of apathy. Rebecca Solnit says, "Despair demands less of us. It's more predictable, and in a sad way, safer." Revolutions are founded on the backs of those who don't cling to the sides for safety. Revolutions are founded by intellectuals who have been able to challenge the systems they find themselves in. This is the pattern of anti-capitalism. Simply put, hopeful people are willing to act. Hope encourages political activism. When we turn out to vote, understanding that every little voice adds up, we can create a change. Often the biggest elections are not swayed by the positions of the people, but rather their apathy. The millennials and Generation Z are predicted to be the least likely to vote for Donald Trump in the next election, and yet these demographics are also the least likely to vote. Why do so many of these young, passionate people refuse to act? For some, it is an issue of time and availability. For many, it is active voter suppression. But for several, the issue comes down to the safety that lies in apathy. There is no risk in betting on failure, and when our younger generations aren't able to see that a hopeful future is possible, they are not willing to work for one. As Rebecca Solnit puts it, being politically engaged means having a sense of your own power, that what you do matters, and a sense of belonging. The final aspect needed to hope for a better future is a great deal of imagination. For many fighting for a future system outside of capitalism, the dream is unclear. For most of us today, a world free from capitalist oppression may be unimaginable. It takes a certain amount of strength to look beyond what is here and see a vision to a future that has not yet been created. Imagination backed by hope is the antithesis of inevitability. Inevitability exists to keep us from imagining, to keep us from dreaming of a future that does not mirror the past. Inevitability tells us that everything is set in stone and we are doomed to repeat the mistakes we learned in history class. Inevitability does not think outside the box. It does not give us the freedom to dream, to fight for another world, one that we can only see in our minds right now. Inevitability tells us to imagine a new future is pointless, and that we cannot fight for something that is not yet tangible. Yet, hope allows us to see how things have become tangible. With hope in our foresight, we can see that the present, in a way, is a system that can only be imagined by yesterday's visionaries. Hope fuels the future, and we are seeing young and hopeful generations take to the streets, daring to fight for a world they can imagine. More and more movements today are being run without clear leaders. This, in itself, is a tactic of the future. Movements that depend on a leader are only as strong as the leader. 30 years ago, few people could imagine that such strong movements could come about without one face leading them, and yet, today, we are seeing movements led by the people. Rebecca Solnit says no great new leaders were emerging because it was time for us to cease being followers. Perhaps we have. The idea of leaderless movements, in and of itself, is revolutionary. We are living through the revolution right now, and that, on its own, is reason enough to hope. So, to go back to my original question, why must we hope? Rebecca Solnit says, to hope is to gamble, is to bet on the future, on your desires, on the possibility that an open heart and uncertainty is better than gloom and safety. To hope is dangerous, and yet is the opposite of fear, for to live is to risk. To disprove the myth of capitalism, we must first have hope. We must have hope that nothing is inevitable, and thus the darkness of the future is not so much the darkness of despair, but rather the darkness of the unknown. Our future is yet to be molded. Despite what institutions built on the foundations of capitalism try to tell us, no system is destined for the world. It is up to us to come into a class consciousness, to fight for the future we imagine for ourselves, to educate and celebrate our victories, and to not lose sight of hope. With each spark of hope, we are lighting a match into the future, and with enough hope, we can set the current systems ablaze.